There are men who leave behind money when they die. And then there are men who leave behind a world. Phil Robertson was the second kind. When the founder of Duck Commander and the undeniable patriarch of one of America's most recognizable families passed away in May 2025, the people who loved him most found themselves standing in a lawyer's office, holding envelopes they were almost afraid to open. What was inside wasn't just a legal document dividing up an estate. It was the final voice of a man who had spent his entire life saying exactly what he meant, and in death, he meant every word more than ever. The Robertson family had prepared themselves for losing him. What they had not prepared for was what he left behind, and what it would cost them emotionally to receive it. To understand why Phil Robertson's farewell hit his family so hard, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of Duck Dynasty, not the beginning of Duck Commander, but the real beginning. The Louisiana swamps. The poverty. The hunger. Phil was born in 1946 into a family where survival was not a figure of speech. Meals came from the water and the woods. Luxury was a concept that belonged to other people. From the time he was old enough to hold a fishing pole, Phil understood that the land gave you what you earned, and nothing more. That lesson never left him. Not when he became a football star at Louisiana Tech. Not when Duck Commander turned into a multi-million-dollar brand. Not even when 11 million Americans were watching his family on television every week. He remained at his core the same self-reliant man shaped by hard ground and harder times. What many people forget is that Phil Robertson was genuinely talented in the conventional sense. He quarterbacked Louisiana Tech with enough skill that his backup, a young man named Terry Bradshaw, would go on to win 4 Super Bowl rings in the NFL. Phil had a path to professional football. He chose duck hunting instead. That choice, which most people would call reckless, was actually the most honest thing about him. He knew who he was, and he refused to become anyone else. That refusal to compromise would define every chapter of his life, including the final one. But honesty also requires acknowledging the years Phil himself never tried to hide, even though plenty of his fans wished he would. Before the faith, before the business, before the cameras, there was a version of Phil Robertson that his family barely survived. In his own words, spoken publicly on multiple occasions, Phil admitted to years of alcohol abuse, a violent temper, and the kind of selfishness that tears families apart. Miss Kay, who married him when she was just a teenager, raised their children during stretches when Phil was absent, unpredictable, and consumed by his own demons. She prayed. She stayed. She held the household together with a kind of quiet strength that Phil would later describe as one of God's greatest gifts to him. The transformation came through Christianity. Phil walked into a church in West Monroe, Louisiana, as one kind of man and walked out as another. He would spend the rest of his life insisting that this conversion was the most important event of his entire existence, more significant than any business success, any television appearance, any political endorsement. He rebuilt his marriage. He apologized to his sons. He redirected the same fierce energy that had once driven him toward destruction and pointed it squarely at faith, family, and purpose. The man who became famous for plain-spoken conviction had earned that conviction the hard way. His family knew that story better than anyone, and is precisely why what he left them in his final days carried so much weight. When the Robertson family publicly announced in December 2020 that Phil had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, most people outside the family assumed the word early stage meant time. It did not. The disease moved with a speed that stunned even those closest to him. The early signs were familiar enough. Misplaced items, repeated questions, moments where a sentence would lose its direction midway through. But within weeks those moments became episodes, and those episodes became the new normal. A man who had always been the loudest and most certain presence in any room began to drift. By April 2025, his son Jace spoke openly on the Unashamed podcast, not with the careful language of someone managing a public image, but with the rawness of a son watching his father fade. He said his father was not doing well, and that the family was focused on keeping him comfortable. Those words, simple and unpolished, told a full story in a way that no press release ever could. Yet even then, Phil managed to record final podcast episodes in which his voice carried its familiar steadiness, his faith its familiar certainty. Those recordings would later feel, to everyone who loved him, like letters sent from just across a threshold, a final effort to leave something behind that illness could not erase. On the morning of May 25, 2025, Phil Robertson passed away at home. He was 79 years old. His family was with him. The announcement came from his son Jace first, a few sentences that contained multitudes. The simplicity of the words matched the man himself. He was gone, and everything he had spent his life building was now in the hands of those he loved. The private funeral was held the way Phil would have demanded, without celebrity, without cameras, without the apparatus of fame intruding on something sacred. Family, close friends, scripture, and the particular silence that only exists between people who have shared decades of real life together. By every account, it was honest and it was hard. But the moment that truly shattered the family came afterward, when they gathered to hear what Phil had arranged for them before his mind had fully surrendered to the disease. His estate, estimated to be worth somewhere between $10 and $15 million, had been built over a lifetime. Duck Commander, Duck Dynasty, books, licensing agreements, speaking engagements, and years of podcasting to an audience that hung on every word. That wealth was real, and it was significant. But what made people cry was not the money. Phil had prepared handwritten letters for each member of his immediate family. Written in his own hand, unassisted, composed while he still had the clarity to choose every word carefully. These were not legal formalities. They were the final conversations he knew he might not be able to have in person. Miss K, his wife and the woman who had stood beside him through his worst years and his best ones, received full ownership of the family home, the place where everything had started and everything had been preserved. His son Alan, a pastor, received Phil's lifetime collection of personal religious writings. Jace and Jep received shares of Duck Commander, along with Phil's direct written charge to guard what had always stood for. His daughter Phyllis, whom Phil had only come to know later in life after years of separation, received land and a personal apology written in his own shaking hand. And Willie, the son who had taken Duck Commander from a regional operation to a national name, received the controlling interest in the family business, along with a message that cut straight to the heart of everything Phil valued: protect the faith, protect the legacy. When the last letter was read aloud, the room went quiet in the way that only happens when something is truly over. The grief was not about money. It was about recognition. Each letter told its recipient that Phil had seen them, really seen them, and had thought carefully about who they were and what they needed to carry his story forward. That kind of love, communicated at the very end of a life, has a weight that no dollar figure can measure. Phil Robertson will be remembered in different ways by different people. To the audience that watched Duck Dynasty at its peak, he was the bearded swamp patriarch who said things on camera that most television personalities would never dare say. To the conservative political world, he was a figure of cultural resistance, someone who refused to soften his beliefs regardless of the pressure applied. To his critics, he was a man whose words caused real pain to real people, and that part of his legacy is not something history will simply set aside. But within his family, the conversation is more complete and more complicated. They knew the man who had failed them and returned. They knew the man who built something from nothing and refused to let go of what it meant. They knew the man who faced the deterioration of his own mind with the same stubbornness he had brought to every other challenge in his life, not pretending it wasn't happening, but refusing to let fear be the last thing he communicated to the people he loved. The revival of Duck Dynasty on A&E, set to premiere in the summer of 2025, with the next generation of Robertsons at the center, will carry forward a brand that Phil built. Willie will manage the business with the weight of his father's final instructions behind every decision. Jace will continue the podcast that Phil helped shape into something far larger than a simple media project. The family will appear on screens again, tell stories again, and face the public again, all without the man who made it possible standing beside them. Phil Robertson spent his life preparing for death. He talked about it openly, without fear, and with the kind of calm that only comes from genuine belief. He told his family not to cry when he was gone, to sing and celebrate instead. Most of them could not honor that request. The grief was too real, and the love that produced it was too deep to contain. What he left behind was not just a fortune. It was a map. A map drawn in shaking handwriting on personal letters, pointing each person he loved toward the version of themselves he believed they were capable of becoming. That is a rare kind of inheritance. And it is the reason that when the last envelope was opened in that lawyer's office, the tears that came were not only about loss. They were about the full and overwhelming weight of being truly, deeply known by someone who is no longer there to say it out loud. Phil Robertson is gone, but the man wrote his own ending, and he made sure his family would carry it forward.